just how big were the first Band-Aids on this episode of Antique Bottle Stories. 1886 was a great time to start a business. Standard Time had just been introduced by the railroads in 1883. Interestingly, before that, each town set its clocks to its own time based on the sun's position in the sky as they saw it. As the trains became more popular, a standard time had to be implemented. Technological advances, such as telephones and typewriters, were revolutionizing the workplace, and the economy was transforming, from one based on farming to one based on industry. Innovation seemed to be everywhere, and there was so much possibility for someone looking to go into business. Our story starts in 1885. James Wood Johnson and his two brothers, Robert Wood Johnson and Edward Meade Johnson, were inspired by a speech by Dr. Joseph Lister. You can learn about Lister in my Listerine video, but in short, he started the idea of sterilization in medicine. The Johnson brothers wanted to start manufacturing sterile medical supplies. The following year, they founded Johnson & Johnson in New Brunswick, New Jersey. There's 3 Johnson brothers, and only 2 Johnsons in the name. Well, the company was named for James and Edward. The older brother, Robert, was in a previous business, and he was still bound by the terms of that agreement. So he would join later that year, and when he did, he became president of the company. While Robert was working on severing his previous partnership, James and Edward got the tiny new company with only 14 employees ready to start working. The first employees were 7 men and 7 women. The first thing they had to do was build a machinery that could mass-produce sterile surgical dressings. James was an engineer, so he started building the machinery. The first year in business, Johnson & Johnson had over 1,000 customers. Many of them were small retail pharmacists. In 1886, sterilized medical supplies were not the norm, so it took a little time for the idea to get a foothold. Johnson & Johnson had to pave the way for the medical and surgical profession. 2 years after starting the business, the company came up with the first commercial first aid kit. They were initially designed to help the railroad workers. Apparently, injuries were very common in railroad workers. The company made first aid kits that could stabilize the injury until the patient got to proper medical help. Soon, it became the standard and everyone wanted them. Johnson & Johnson was founded at a time when doctors were just starting to study women's health and childbirth. Up until the 1900s, the majority of women gave birth at home, obviously without the help of trained medical professionals. In an unsterile environment, infections were common, and 1 in 10 babies died, and also many mothers. To combat these statistics, Johnson & Johnson released the first maternity kit in 1894. The kit included sterile medical supplies to help with the birth and the first few days of life, as well as an educational pamphlet for expectant mothers. Included in the supplies were sanitary napkins, which the company then began selling for menstruation 3 years later. The first Johnson & Johnson sanitary pads were also known as Lister's towels. Again, a nod to Dr. Lister. Along those same lines, in the 1960s, Johnson & Johnson were one of the first companies to develop a birth control pill. About 10 years into the business, in 1895, Edward left the family business to start a new company called Meade Johnson, which produced nutrition products for infants and children. It's actually still in business today. When Robert Wood died in 1910, his brother James became president of Johnson & Johnson. Then, James's son became president in 1932. It wasn't until 1921 that Band-Aids hit the market. The first Band-Aid adhesive bandages were made by hand, measuring 2.5 inches wide and 18 inches long. They were huge. They weren't very popular at first because people didn't know how to use them. But the sales increased after the company hired some traveling salesmen to go demonstrate to doctors and pharmacists on how the darn things work. Johnson & Johnson bought fruit jars from the Consolidated Fruit Jar Manufacturing Company. They used a fruit jar because it sealed and clamped, and the surgical gauze or dressing would stay sterile. The amber color also protected it from harmful light. John Landis Mason, the inventor of this particular fruit jar, and would later be famous for his mason jar, was partnered with Johnson & Johnson for a while. My jar is one of these fruit jars, and it held about 1 yard of sterile gauze. It was dug out of the ground and the lid's gone. It has Johnson & Johnson, New Brunswick, New Jersey, and a Red Cross at the bottom of the jar. According to the website, they didn't make these for very long before moving on to the next idea. So I date this somewhere around the 1890s, and I couldn't find a date on when they stopped being used. Today, the Johnson & Johnson headquarters now sits where the Consolidated Fruit Jar Manufacturing Company once stood. And that's all I've got for today. So we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.